Yeah, I think more people will come in.
He said 20.
Good morning. I'm Howard Walpe. I direct the leadership project here and the Africa program at the Wilson Center, and delighted to welcome all of you to the center this morning. First, just a brief word about the center for those of you who may be new to the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center was established by an act of Congress back in 1968 as the living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, the only American president to have had a PhD and who was a university professor and president. And the center was established to memorialize his passion of merging the world of ideas with the world of public policy. So we are a neutral, nonpartisan center devoted to research, reflection, debate on every conceivable issue, both global and national. Today's event will be webcast live, and is the first of a series of events focusing upon the question of the United Nations reform direction in the months ahead. I'm delighted to welcome to the center our distinguished guests this morning and this morning's panel. Today's event, Getting the Job Done, Completing the Pending UN Reform Agenda, is one of several events convened during the annual UN Week of Intensive Programs organized by the United Nations Association of the National Capital Branch on the occasion of the anniversary of the entry into force of the UN Charter. This is the first event in a 3-meeting series entitled The Reform Agenda for the Next UN Secretary General that seeks to help identify and to concretize the policy priorities in the areas of reform, peace building, sustainable development, and the environment in anticipation of the upcoming anticipation of the emergence of a new Secretary General. The Wilson Center is delighted to co-sponsor this event with the UNA-NCA chapter, with the UNA-USA's Council of Organizations, and with the Better World campaign. Today's meeting will review lessons learned from the current Secretary General's term with a specific emphasis on the challenges and opportunities that face the next Secretary General with respect to UN reform. The upcoming second and third meetings in the series will consider the next 5 years of the new Secretary General's term and address priorities in the peace agenda, as well as examine issues of environmental sustainability and development, focusing on the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. I'm now pleased to introduce the individual who will be outlining and introducing, framing today's event, Ed Elmendorf, the president of the United Nations Association of the NCA. Ed has been involved in international organizations for over 40 years and has worked and written on health strategy and policy in Africa for the past 15 years. He began his career in the United States Foreign Service in 1963 when he was immediately assigned to work at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. In 1965, he served as the personal assistant to U.S. ambassadors to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson and Arthur Goldberg. He was seconded from the Foreign Service to the UN Secretariat from 1967 to 69, where he worked as special assistant to the Assistant Secretary General for Interagency Affairs, with responsibilities concerning effective cooperation between the United Nations and the specialized agencies. And then in 1970, he left the Foreign Service to join the World Bank. During his 30-year career at the World Bank, Ed initially worked in policy planning on loan programming and negotiations with North African countries and personnel management. He then led the bank's work in country assistance strategy, lending and macroeconomic policy in Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, and Indian Ocean countries. Today, he teaches at Johns Hopkins University, works as a consultant for the World Bank, for WHO, and the UN Development Program. He has also assisted in the founding of an African health advocacy NGO, the African Council for Sustainable Health Development, which is based in Nigeria. So I'm delighted to welcome Ed and look forward to this morning's panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Volpe. I'll stay here if that's all right. And I will. Thank you, David. Mr. Ambassador, Professor Luck, for the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area, it's a great privilege to co-sponsor this important forum with the Woodrow Wilson International Center and other partner organizations. The event is part of a larger program of UNA-NCA in two respects. First, it's part of the annual UN Week of events mentioned by Mr. Volpe, where UNA-NCA partners with large numbers of other organizations to organize various kinds of events about and for the United Nations here in Washington. This is now going on. It will go on for the rest of this week. There is a copy of the program out on the desk there, and I encourage all of you to pick up a copy and see what might interest you. The program here is also a part of the work of a UN Reform task force sponsored by UNA-NCA. This task force is co-chaired by former Assistant Secretary of State Princeton Lyman and retired businessman Toby Mercuro. Unfortunately, neither of them could be with us today. The task force is also working with a comparable group in New York City, orchestrated through the headquarters offices of UNA USA, with the involvement of Ambassador Pickering. We are working both through public forums as well as through private dialogue to encourage forward movement on the very difficult and complicated UN reform agenda which will face the next Secretary General. I think I would rather limit my comments to that, since we have on this forum distinguished speakers who will have a lot to contribute, and I think particularly it's appropriate that we have a non-governmental forum here so that we can have the most open exchange of views among everyone. And I want to thank you, David, and move on from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. I'm David Birenbaum. I'm a senior scholar here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Our speakers today could not be more qualified or experienced in terms of this particular subject, UN reform, and in particular the experience to date in getting the job done, completing the agenda put forward, the massive agenda put forward by the Secretary General. Jan Eliasson has had an extremely distinguished career both in the Swedish government and in the UN. He was the foreign minister of Sweden, the Swedish ambassador to the United States, the Swedish ambassador to the United Nations, and at the United Nations he has held a number of significant senior positions, including Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, the first person to hold that job. In his capacity as the President of the General Assembly during the 60th session, he, of course, had primary responsibility for presiding over the General Assembly's deliberations on implementing the recommendations of the Secretary General, especially for management reform, which will be our focus, although each of the two speakers is, of course, free to comment on any other aspect of reform that they would like to address. Ed Luck, as people who have attended prior sessions of this here at the Wilson Center on UN Reform are well aware, is one of the nation's leading scholars of UN affairs. He's the professor of practice in international and public affairs and director of the Center on International Organizations of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. That's a mouthful, Ed. Before coming to Columbia, he also served as the founder, he was the founder and served as the executive director of the Center for the Study of International Organization, a research center jointly established by the School of Law of New York University and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs of Princeton University. Ed has also served as the president of UNA and has been a leading advisor to any number of senior UN officials, including past presidents of the General Assembly, and he was the staff director of an open-ended working group of the General Assembly, which was formed when I was at the U.S. UN. This was in 1994, I guess, Ed, wasn't it? Anyway, it was on the subject of strengthening the UN. And, of course, he did such a good job, as I did, on dealing with reform, that all of the issues were addressed long ago. Just a few words on how we intend to proceed. I've asked each of the two speakers to talk for, say, 20 minutes on the subject of UN reform, management reform. We really want to focus here not so much on the specific proposals, which have been addressed at prior sessions here and certainly in many, many other fora in Washington, but rather on the politics, the difficult problems of how to actually get reform accomplished. And who better to address that subject than the man who presided over the process in the last session of the General Assembly, Jan Eliasson. Then, after the presentations, we will have a brief moderated discussion among the four of us, and then I will open the floor for your questions. This session is on the record, and as you have been told, it's being webcast, so we will have a record of what transpires at this session and at the ones to follow. Beyond that, it is our intention to use these three discussions as the basis of preparing a memorandum which we would submit to the new Secretary General, reflecting the views and the advice, all of it sage, I'm sure, that will be generated during the course of these sessions. So, Jan, would you start, and then we'll just proceed.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you, Ed, for arranging this meeting and this discussion. I think the combination UN-USA is absolutely crucial. The more the multilateral thinking can be developed, particularly in the larger countries, the better. So I commend you for the work you do. And I've always taken great pleasure in visiting the Woodrow Wilson International Center as ambassador and for the UN. And now I have none of the jobs mentioned above. I'm now giving face to unemployment, but gives me perhaps more freedom of expression, and I will try to make use of that today. I'm glad, David, when you introduced me, you didn't do the mistake that one lady did who misprinted my CV in its abbreviated version at a speech I gave. As you may know, I've been involved in mediation efforts, Iran, Iraq, Nagorno-Karabakh, Sudan, etc. But the misprint was pretty strange and led me to have an audience that I didn't recognize. It was a strange collection of people with beard and strange-looking people, and it turned out that the misprint was that Ambassador Eliasson is an expert in meditation. But I see the UN look at you. I thought I would just very briefly look back at the year that I presided in the General Assembly and the UN reform negotiations, and then I will try to say a few words about a few lessons learned from that process. As to the reform year, I think, without perhaps highlighting our own work, that we achieved a little bit more than I expected. The laundry list, the to-do list was so long from the summit meeting in September 2005. I think it was 180 or some paragraphs, and the list of things to do was very, very long. But I think we did perhaps the most important things and a little bit more than most people expected. Some of the steps taken are, in my view, qualitative steps forward if they are implemented on the ground. And some make sure that we maintain the balance between the three pillars of the United Nations, which have to be always maintained, namely the work for peace and security one, and the work for development, sustainable development on the second place, and on the other hand, and thirdly the respect of human rights. These are the three pillars, and one of them was in danger, I must say, and during those negotiations, the human rights dimension. The first important achievement, I think, was the Peace Building Commission that was established by a resolution on the 20th of December last year. I won't go through the details of that resolution, and it is the one that I hinted to just seconds ago, namely that's where we have to see how it works on the country level. We now have the organizational committee in place. We're going to start the work on the ground. Howard Wolpe and I talked about that. Burundi will be the test case, and the country-specific work will be crucial. But what is the innovative approach of that Peace Building Commission is that we are creating links between the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC. I think we're also mobilizing all actors, both within the United Nations, and they need to be organized and coordinated better. That I know from my time as Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. But also with regional organizations, with the NGOs, with the private sector, and of course with national institutions. This shows the need for mobilization and division of labor among the actors. I hope this will work. And of course the basic message of the Peace Building Commission is that we must not continue to make the mistake that we have done for so long, namely to leave a country which has been plagued by conflict. Once the CNN and television cameras disappear, we just leave it and then we pay a price, as we have done in Afghanistan, as it seems we are doing now in Somalia. And we have to hang in there, we have to do reconstruction, we have to do development, we have to set up institutions, we have to do reconciliation process so that the conflicts do not erupt again. In 50% of the conflicts the last 20 years, they have erupted again in some form within 5 years. It's an unacceptable statistics. And by hanging in there together with the national actors, we hope to change those tragic statistics. Another item which wasn't that noticed, in my view, was the Central Emergency Response Fund, CERF. I was thinking of this for many, many years since my time, again, as Emergency Relief Coordinator. I had Jan Egeland's job, as David said, the first one to have that job. And it was, to me, humiliating that after the disasters, particularly natural disasters, tsunami, the earthquake, Asia, and I had my experiences back in the early 90s, that we had to go with, hat in hand and ask for money while people are dying out there on the shores or in the mountains. And now we have a response fund that is available immediately, so we can mobilize immediately and send out the helicopters and do everything and not even think about costs. Because as you know, in natural disasters, 95% of the people die the first 64 hours. So that was a very important decision. I felt great satisfaction at that in December last year too. A qualitative step forward. That it works in such a way that you do the things that are needed and then it's filled up, the fund is filled up from behind. It's supposed to reach a $500 million level. I think we are now at $270 million or so. Another step which wasn't noticed either as much as I would have hoped was that we, in the end of the session, succeeded in deciding on a strategy on counterterrorism. Very concrete. Some things did not get in there, some things were missing, nobody was really 100% happy. But if you think of the value of having the United Nations by consensus establishing a counter-terrorist strategy, sends the very important message that this is a global threat. and not an issue that is driven by one country or in the interest of one country or a group of countries. I felt both the symbolic and practical importance of that strategy was perhaps not noticed as much as I think it should. And I would say in all openness that I think I would go even as far as saying that the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism, to finalize that, has also, in my view, been exaggerated. 90% of the substance of that convention is already done. We are talking about wrapping up the Christmas present. It's the ribbon. But there's been so much attention to that Comprehensive Convention. I feel that now with the strategy we should really show that we have now this as a UN task, and then of course we will continue to get the Comprehensive Convention. But that I felt an enormous satisfaction in having decided on in the end of the session. It was taken actually my last day of work on the 8th of September, this past month. Then of course there was the Human Rights Council. That gave me more work than any other negotiation process. I have to go back to negotiations like Iran, Iraq, and negotiating the House of Sweden here in Washington in terms of a degree of difficulty of negotiations. But it worked in the end. We got it through. Unfortunately, not with consensus. The vote was 170 in favor, 4 against, and 3 abstentions. And unfortunately, the United States was among those voting against, together with Israel, Marshall Islands, and Palau. And the abstentions were from Iran, Venezuela, and Belarus. But 170 nations voted in favor, and I think it has great legitimacy. I know there are voices of disappointment at the session this summer, partly influenced by events, real events in the Middle East, but also reflecting some of the bad habits of the Commission, I must say. But still, if you look at this resolution, the text of it, it sets standards, it requires pledges to human rights, it opens up the possibility to suspend membership in the Council if there is grave violations of human rights. There is even a preventive clause in it, one of the first preventive clauses in any resolution of this nature. What I think was the main driving force for me was simply that I felt that if we hadn't finished that negotiation on the Human Rights Council, we would have been stuck for a long time. I can almost bet you that we would be in negotiation now. We might be in negotiation next year. It was a very sensitive balance in that text, and I felt at that time also we almost lost it, because as you may recall, February, March this year was the time of the so-called cartoon and caricature crisis. And there were strong requirements from the Islamic countries that we should have a part of the resolution on respect of religion, which would, of course, have opened up the Pandora's box of other countries requesting to have the freedom of the press mentioned in the same context. And you can imagine the situation that could have arisen diplomatically on that issue. Fortunately, I talked them out of it. But I felt there was so much at stake, and there was deep suspicions. And I was almost seeing the risk that human rights could become a North-South issue or a West-Islam issue at that time. And can you imagine anything more serious than having the Universal Declaration be seen as a Western and Northern concept? And the kind of negotiations we would have had now on this if we hadn't gone through. I was under strong pressure to open up negotiations again, and I resisted that. It was a bit of psychological warfare. I will not mention names, but it was an interesting process. We stuck to our guns, if I may say so, even if I believe in peaceful solutions. And we went through, and I felt that we maintained that third pillar of the United Nations. I would go as far as say that human rights is the soul of the United Nations. And if we had lost that, we would have lost the steam, all the spiritual element practically of what drives this organization, or what should drive this organization. So those were the main points, I think, what we achieved. What we didn't achieve was we didn't do enough on management, David, I must admit. We did a few good things, but the mandate review is extremely difficult, and that is a process that will have to go on for a long time. We have to institute a culture of not only accountability, but also a culture of efficiency in this organization. Now I speak also as a former Under-Secretary General. There is a lot of work to be done, and this new Secretary General will have a major task in the management area. And we didn't do the Security Council reform either. I simply came to the conclusion that this was like bringing in a gorilla in the room, because it would have been probably stopped the other reform processes, and it seemed to me that the issue wasn't ripe. In order to make it as a new permanent member for the 4 aspiring countries in G4 you need to have 2/3 of the member states vote, 234 or so. And this was questionable whether they would achieve. And if that had happened with a divisive vote, you would have brought in enormous tensions in the organization. And as you understand, the Security Council seat, the permanent Security Council seat, is a matter of national security. Both of the countries are interested in having that seat. And those who fear that the countries who are interested in having it, those who oppose that, will also consider it in their national interests. I just say China, Japan, and I say Pakistan, India, and I think you see what I mean, and the tensions involved. That issue simply could not be pushed by the present General Assembly. I was tempted to try my hand at it, but was dissuaded during the course. And now I think I've received grateful remarks, both from parts of the G4 and those in the other camp, uniting for consensus. That issue will, of course, remain, because we need to have a reform of the Security Council for representativity in the organization, but also, I think, for the cause of efficiency and legitimacy. I think I could leave it at that, except saying that it was a pretty tough exercise. And I think we developed, in a strange way, a sort of teamwork spirit in the organization in the last moments when we were sitting in those last sessions, and I had the key actors in and appealed to them to lift themselves from their national perspectives to the international. I think they, in most cases, in practically all cases, listened. In spite of what I would call an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust, which is obvious. You can't hide the United Nations from the realities in the world, the realities in the Middle East, the realities of poverty, the realities of the fight on terrorism and its forms. You know, it translates into the corridors, and there was a lot of suspicion. I mentioned the cartoon crisis, and that brought me to some reflections on the globalization. We say casually that we know so much about each other, and now with the free and quick movement of ideas and information, we are so well informed, and then you see this cartoon crisis explode in our face, and what do we see? In Denmark, caricatures of the prophet, and I would bet you that only 2% of the Danish population knew what depicting the prophet would mean to the Muslim world. That you don't simply depict the face of the prophet. And I would bet you also that those who ran on the streets in Damascus and burned the Scandinavian embassies, 2% of them knew that the Danish government could not ban an article in a paper in Denmark. So when you scratch the surface of globalization, there's a lot of lack of knowledge, gulf of lack of knowledge in my view. That brings me to the lessons learned. Ed and I are old friends. We will continue that discussion later on, but I'll just say a few things that I have been reflecting upon during the past few weeks when I'm absorbing the shocks of the negotiations of this 60th session. One conclusion I draw is that we should really try to break down more walls. We have to take a more comprehensive and holistic approach. We compartmentalize too much. The problems are horizontal, but we organize ourselves vertically. security, development, and human rights are connected. There is no security without development. There is no development without security. There is none of the above without respect to human rights. And we need also to, as I indicated on the Peace Building Commission discussion earlier, we need also to think in terms of international division of labor. The problems of today's world on the global arena are so serious and so large that we simply cannot leave it only to the United Nations. It also puts the United Nations in great problems in terms of public opinion, disappointment of not delivering and so forth, and then blaming the UN. We need to realize that there are other actors who also have to deal with the global problems. Also because they are not only global. If you look at the global issues, just translate them to the national scene. They are there too. Migration. How can you draw a line between domestic and international on a migration? Environment. Same thing. Communicable diseases. Same thing. Organized crime. They are both national, regional, and global. Therefore, we have to have a new international division of labor and put the burden of expectations of delivering solutions, or approaches at least, to global problems also through other actors. And let us remember these geniuses who wrote the Charter, wrote a chapter in the UN Charter about regional arrangements, regional organizations, before most of them existed, and made regional arrangements part of a UN Charter. I think there is a tremendous potential in bringing in the regional actors, European Union, African Union, as part of a global pattern of cooperation in a more organized way. And I would hope that this could be one of the issues that the new Secretary General could take up. I think there is an energy to be tapped from regional organizations and also from the sectors I mentioned earlier on Peace Building Commission, the private sector, the NGOs, the civil society generally. So that is my first basic reflection, that we need to have a more comprehensive, holistic approach. We need to think in terms of international distribution of labor. And we should learn to put the problem in the center. Put the problem in the center, not the organization, not the bureaucracy in the center. We are stuck in organizational thinking. We should put that problem in the center and then look at it from the different perspectives. I have an example. When I was USG for Humanitarian Affairs, I came back from Somalia, Mozambique, Iraq. I had seen the effects of landmines. This was 1992. And I was so upset. And I came back to a meeting in the United Nations with the USGs, 8 people, and Boutros Ghali was Secretary General at that meeting. And I said, I will not go on with it. I will only take this job. I will continue if we have a program on landmines. It's a humanitarian problem also, apart from the legal and others, I said. This must be a problem because I had a project for the humanitarian sector, because I had seen the effects out there in the field. And the first reaction I got from one of them, it's still under censorship, who said that. He said, "You can't do that, Jan." "Why not?" I said. "There's no department of the United Nations responsible for landmines." Yeah, I laughed like you. And then to improve the argument, this person said, knowing that it was a bit embarrassing to say that, he said, "Well, I mean that we simply do not have a mandate to work with it." And I thought to myself, he made the same mistake in that second remark, because he didn't put the problem in the center. I said to him, "Listen, I can get Sweden, Canada, Norway, Netherlands tomorrow to get a resolution on landmines. And then we deal with it." So, problem in the center. Second is, and Ed has heard this so many times, prevention. We really have to take this seriously now. Why wait all the time until these problems are unbearable? We know that they are coming. We could identify 4 or 5 spots now where things will get worse. Why don't we act early on? Why do we need to wait until the wounds get infected? It's absolutely crucial that this preventive thinking continues. I see Melanie Greenberg in the room, you and David Hamburg and others are working on this, Ed also, but we need to bring this to a more practical, concrete stance. The debate has been almost on the same level as it was in the early 90s. We have to be serious about it. And I think the Security Council should be serious about it. I had high-level discussions with the P5 during the past year, and even afterwards I've talked to them informally. I said, if the Security Council is to maintain its authority and legitimacy, particularly after acting so late on Lebanon this summer, you really have to get going on prevention. You are supposed to you have a responsibility for international peace and security. You are supposed to act on threats to international peace and security. What is a threat? Threat is before it happens. I would even go as far as say that it's a charter obligation to act on threats. That means that the Security Council should get involved not when the house is burning, or as they often do, when the house has burnt down, as was the case in Lebanon, but when the smoke develops, or even better, when the arsonist reaches for the match. That's more dignified. That is to save money, and it's to save lives, and it's to save the reputation of international organizations, and many governments too, by the way. And now we have the responsibility to protect. I regret that we didn't highlight it enough during the session. I was worried that it could be devalued, because there's lots of suspicion that this is another expression of humanitarian intervention, which I think is wrong. The responsibility to protect is, in fact, more respect shown to the government and to their responsibilities and their sovereignty. It says that you are supposed to stop ethnic cleansing and mass killing and genocide. It is your government's responsibility to prevent that from happening. By that, we show more respect for sovereignty. But then we also, of course, add, with a bit of convoluted language, very difficult negotiation, I can tell you, that if you don't make it, the international community has a responsibility to protect population. This is something that goes beyond the Security Council. This all countries, 192 countries, have signed on to. And that we should live up to. We should pick out that text look it up in the outcome document, the Declaration of September. Enlarge it, frame it, and put it on the wall, everywhere. Because we can't continue to say never again. Holocaust, Cambodia, Rwanda, Srebrenica, Darfur. It completely undermines the moral authority of the United Nations and those countries who, particularly on the Security Council, serve there. But now it's a wider responsibility, with the responsibility to protect, I claim. My last point is simply this that I hinted earlier. We have to do more of bridge building. I fear this Islam-West difficulty. I was about to say confrontation. Hope to God it doesn't happen. I didn't think I would take as seriously as I now do Sam Huntington's book in 1994, was it, on Clash and Civilizations. He was more right than many of us felt at that time. We need to build bridges. It's absolutely crucial that we do so. There are so many strong forces also inside the Islamic world, which direction they go, but also I would say inside our societies, the European societies and the United States. If we disregard that we are multicultural already, and at the same time build walls against another category of countries with another religion, we also have a ticking bomb in our own societies. 5 million, 6 million in Germany, France, UK. Sweden has 400,000 Muslims in a population of 9 million. We are already mixed. We are already living together, but we are identifying other groups and defined in religious and ethnic terms as potential enemies. And what do we then do? We run now the risk that we define the outside world as a threat. The world outside can risk becoming a threat. It's from there, from the outside, from the foreigners. You see the quotation marks, I hope, that you get the drugs, you get the crime, you get the prostitution, you get the diseases, and to which you lose the jobs. And then political forces can fish in those murky waters and identify migration and the immigrants and so forth as a problem, and the explanation of the difficulties at home. So we will see the outside world as a peril and a danger, not as a potential, a possibility. And this in the age of globalization. Can you imagine the nightmare we are building if we continue that road? So I think that is perhaps the most basic and quasi-philosophical remark that I will do at this time. And by that, I think I've broken your time limit by 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Ed Luck.
Well, I know a hard act to follow when I see one. I've just seen one, and you've had the pleasure of hearing one. It's nice to be back at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and it's nice to be back with the National Capital Area Division of UNA. It's nice to see that both organizations are prospering, and even more that they're working together. I think it's terrific. I would agree with Jan that the results of the reform were both modest but respectable. I think under the circumstances, he certainly achieved more than anyone could have or should have expected. But my concern isn't with what Jan was able to achieve, but why was he given such a weak hand to play with? What if we had had a weak president of the General Assembly last year? Choosing presidents of the General Assembly is even less scientific than choosing secretaries general for the organization. They've been up and down a lot. And what if we had not had someone with the energy, the commitment, the knowledge, and the vision that Jan had? This reform could have been in very, very bad trouble. And I think we need to ask in a very sober way, why was it framed the way that it was? Why was this enormous gap between the kind of vision and expectations that the Secretary General had first proposed in September 2003 to the General Assembly and the more modest and more predictable outcome that we achieved? I think one question before getting to lessons learned that I would ask is, what is UN reform? If you look at the outcome document from September of last year, of the 180 paragraphs that Jan mentioned, as far as I can tell, only 13%, less than 1 out of 7, actually dealt with anything that I would have thought was UN reform. Like most UN documents, it dealt with an enormous number of important issues, and some of them, like responsibility to protect, as Jan has mentioned, were important advances. But what they had to do with institutional reform per se is not at all clear to me. And whether, in fact, a more focused effort on a narrower range of reforms might have achieved more, I think is worth asking. Also, I would say at the beginning, given the way that the Secretary General started this after the intervention in Iraq and the split in the Security Council and the feeling that the institution was in very big trouble, we should identify which is the cart and which is the horse. Can you achieve political healing in an organization through trying to achieve institutional reform? Don't you actually have to have the political healing first before you can achieve significant institutional reform? Jan mentioned recently in the prevention this question of if your house is on fire, and I said at the day that the Secretary General gave the speech in September 2003, he was right in recognizing that his house was on fire, but then the response, isn't this a good time to remodel, was the wrong response. It's not a good time to remodel. It's a time to put out the fire. It was not an institutional fire. It was a political fire, and in many ways it's still with us. And it seems to me if the analysis had been a little more sober, perhaps we would have moved in a little bit different way, and perhaps would not have led public expectations talking about a radical reform, another San Francisco moment, a fork in the road, and all the other things, which frankly were not true. There was no San Francisco moment. San Francisco is when states came together. States were not together in 2003 any more than they are today. And it's, to me, a little like throwing oil on the fire to throw a big, big institutional reform, which the GA and 192 member states have to be intimately involved in when they are deeply divided on fundamental political issues. As I say, if we didn't have a fireman of the caliber of Jan Eliasson, this conflagration could have gotten a good deal wider. So let me give you 8 lessons learned. In some ways they overlap with Jan. Some ways I'm sure he would contradict and deny them, and hopefully remain friends by the time we get to point 8. Point 8 he'll like, because point 8 talks about the U.S. piece of this, which I have big problems with as well. The first, and I think this is obvious, or should have been obvious, before embarking in any significant reform, test the political waters before you dive in. And test them not based on hubris and wishful thinking, but rather a very, very sober and deliberate sense of what will the traffic bear in the assembly. We've seen problems in this town with wishful thinking and hubris in recent years in places like Iraq, and unfortunately I think that was catching in terms of the way this was approached, at least on the 38th floor of the UN. Second, and this flows from this, calibrate one's reform plans and expectations and priorities based not only on what the political traffic will bear, but also on past experience. This is not the first time the UN has tried to reform. It has never stopped trying to reform since 1945, and there is a wealth of lessons about what has and hasn't worked in the past, and what kinds of a process leads to what kinds of result. As far as I can tell, that was completely ignored, at least on the 38th floor when this was begun. Yes, you have to aim a little high because you're going to come out a little less than what you expect. But if the leap is so great between what you have any reasonable reason to expect and what you're saying to the public and the media, the way they should judge the organization and assess it. If you say the organization is going off a cliff, you know, it's the end of the world unless you have a really radical, deep reform, be sure you can deliver on that radical, deep reform, or else you're just feeding the critics, which I think is a real problem with all of this. And in that, when you're making that calibration, don't start with the very least probable, the very most difficult issues. Start with those you actually might make some progress on. Think about where you're going to be at the end of the day, and maybe start with some of those kinds of issues. Why, I still don't understand. It was considered, and recently the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General have repeated this, that you have to do radical reform of the Security Council before you can get on with the rest of the agenda. They have both said recently that we can't do real management reform until we solve the Security Council problem. Now, I hope we all should live so long as to solve the Security Council problem. I mean, I worked with Razali Ismail in 96, 97 when he was President of the General Assembly on designing his reforms, and he worked this very hard. He is other than Jan, the last really dynamic President of the General Assembly I can think of, and he worked this issue long and hard. And I think, having talked to him recently, he would not do it again. So, you know, why does one set it up? It's almost like you're trying to set yourself up for failure. So, you know, I would think about that a little bit. Third, and this I think we may disagree a little bit, I would treat each issue on its own merits. And I would not assume that there are a lot of positive linkages among issues. There are lots of linkages among issues in the General Assembly. Rather rarely are those linkages positive. And I think we saw a lot of negative linkages at play, which Jan unfortunately was stuck with trying to undo, and in some cases miraculously was able to, but not so easy. For example, it was widely assumed that you had to give a really big, robust development section for the G77 countries, because otherwise they wouldn't go along with management reform. In other words, they had to have incentives to go along with management reform, because the assumption was that this was a bitter pill that they would have to swallow. They must be against it. Somehow it's not in their interest. It's just in the interest of the U.S. and the other major donors. Therefore, you need a really big development package. Well, I think we need a really big development package because we need big development, not as a way of trying to persuade people to move on a different issue. They did have a very impressive development package. It takes up by far the largest portion of the outcome document for last year. It barely mentions the UN, of course, because it's actually about development and actually seems to be a testimony to the fact that the UN has a fairly modest role in development, whether we like that or not. But it doesn't say anything about reforming the UN, so it would work better in the development field, so it's not really related to reform in that way. So they got most of what they wanted out of this. I can't see what one got in return on the other reforms. Now maybe, Jan was obviously much more involved in negotiations, but we certainly didn't get it in the management area. I mean, that's for sure, because that in many ways has stepped backwards. Fourth, personally, I would avoid big packages. When the Secretary General did his report following the high-level panel report, 4 times in his speech to the General Assembly introducing it, he said that this is a big package and really had to be adopted as a package. Within 10 days, no one on the 38th floor could ever remember that there was any suggestion that it was a package, because obviously the member states did not want to treat it as a package. They have never treated reform as a package. We have never had in 61 years a package of UN reforms that was of any width. Now, why this is going to be different now, I don't know, but it didn't happen. One of the things that it does, and I think some of Jan's comments speak to this, it makes everyone exhausted by the end of the day because their attention is going 40 ways at once, beginning with the most difficult things like the Security Council reform, which is splitting them at the same time, and they have so many priorities that unfortunately at times it didn't seem like there were any priorities. That also raises a question about should you try to make a summit, heads of state and government, the pinnacle, the aiming point for reform. Never before, in 61 years, has the UN conducted any reform, including the time when the Security Council was expanded, at the summit level. It's just never been done. They have summits, but not to do reform. I mean, how many states, heads of state and government understand the inside workings of the UN? Maybe Sweden, I don't know, but not many places. Certainly not many places, and certainly not in this town. If people at a cabinet level have any idea what the inner workings of the UN, they probably wouldn't have gotten the job to begin with. It would be disqualification. But it rarely, it just doesn't tend to go together. So, I'm not sure that was a great piece. And again, my fifth lesson, although I've already sort of suggested it, I would set my priorities clearly. I would have few of them, and I would pursue them very vigorously and unceasingly. Nothing comes easily in the General Assembly, particularly when it comes to reform. And if you're giving them a very broad, typical UN agenda with a 100-item laundry list, you'll get back very little in return. And the hardest thing for the UN, I have always thought, is making choices and setting priorities. I mean, it's the nature of an organization that is virtually universal with 192 member states. They have a really hard time choosing. So if the Secretary General doesn't make some choices at the beginning and doesn't try to pursue particular things, he's not doing the President of the General Assembly, I think, any favor. Sixth, again, these are all, I thought, pretty obvious lessons. A Secretary General ought to listen to the member states and ought to stay in touch with them and stay in touch with the shifting politics of the General Assembly. I don't know how many times various permanent representatives from all parts of the world told me no one on the 38th floor seems to know what we're thinking, what we want. They have a lot of theories, a lot of big concepts, whatever, but no sense that these are actually coming from the member states so much. And actually, I think in the end, if you looked at the reform, you began with the Secretary General and a high-level panel and 101 recommendations. And then he had his report, and then at some point the member states took this over and made it their reform. And obviously working through the President of the General Assembly and created things that made sense. You compare those with the initial proposals, there's some overlap, but they're very, very different kind of package. you have to give the member states a sense of ownership of the process. The high-level panel did a spectacular job on laying out the concepts and interrelationships in terms of security. I thought did a pretty abysmal job in terms of dealing with what the institutional implications were for the organization. Most of them were not that close to the organization, which is why they had big ideas still. It seems to me that that report was widely admired by the member states for the quality of the thinking, but not as a document to lead a reform exercise. So again, I would listen to the member states and stay very much in touch with them. Seventh, and maybe this is my own hubris, I wouldn't assume that the G77 are irrevocably and eternally opposed to any sensible reform of management in the organization. I think the fact that this was assumed at the beginning of the process, it wasn't exactly a self-fulfilling prophecy because there was a lot to it, but it tended to have that, I think, unfortunate consequence. And I think my advice to the new Secretary General, and I don't think he needs the advice because he already believes it, is that he should spend his time consulting with the member states, particularly in this transition period, and as much as possible mold a reform around the way they would like the process to move forward in terms of the management areas. Now, my eighth lesson, which is a long one, is for the U.S. Everyone knows the U.S. has a big stick. The problem is we haven't learned to talk softly. Why we have to remind everyone all the time that we're powerful, that we pay a lot of money, and they ought to listen to us, I don't know. It's enormously counterproductive. I don't know why some of our representatives in New York who are so bright, know so much about the UN, have so little understanding about how it works. It's just extraordinary. Talk softly isn't enough. One has to engage energetically. And I would argue that the U.S. performance on reform the last couple of years has been very preachy and loud, particularly to domestic audiences. Very little engagement. And the results from a U.S. standpoint have been abysmal, absolutely abysmal. And contrast markedly with how well we're doing in the Security Council. Where the U.S. pays attention, where the U.S. actually treats the other member states with some respect, maybe even as peers occasionally, we can actually make some progress on really tough issues, like Iran and Darfur and North Korea and Lebanon. I mean, the series of resolutions out of the Security Council the last year or two have been extraordinary, usually either by unanimity or something very close to unanimity. And yet we get to the General Assembly, we're completely flat-footed. We say we really care about management reform. This is a top priority. We got very little. We say we really cared about the Human Rights Council. We certainly didn't get the Human Rights Council that the U.S. wanted. And I'm one of those, Jan, who feels that it's off to a very, very bad start. And the bad habits are still with us. And whether one can institutionally reform the member states out of bad habits, I don't know. But certainly when the U.S. is voting with a mighty coalition of a combined population of less than 10 million, that's not exercising global leadership on an issue like human rights the way that we ought to be. So whatever happened, we obviously did not engage very effectively. The spending cap backfired terribly. I think if it had been sort of brought through more of a multilateral process, at least among many of the major donors, and maybe with a little more understanding, might have helped. It was sort of, again, put forward in a rather unilateral kind of way and has very much backfired. Why the U.S. even allowed, if you can put it that way, management reform to be the last issue to be taken up when everyone is completely exhausted by everything else and take it up this past spring and summer, I don't know. I mean, it seems either it didn't have very much influence or it wasn't putting very much priority on it. I mean, it seems to me that really the way we have treated this has fed into this perception that the real issue is the U.S. versus the rest. The real issue is U.S. dominance and U.S. power. When I think by our record in the General Assembly on reform, it suggested, in fact, our power, at least in that forum, has been decidedly limited or else squandered in an embarrassing way. So that's my last lesson. The U.S. should get its act together. Now, a word or two on the new Secretary General and where does he go from there? I guess we no longer say whether he or she go from there because somehow, the Chinese kept telling us out of 4 billion Asians, there must be a good Secretary General. And I kept asking them, out of 2 billion Asian women, why wasn't a single one put forward by any of the countries? Extraordinary. The only woman put forward is from a Baltic state. Not very likely to work this year. Anyway, so we have another man as Secretary General. And if people would like to talk about his qualities as much as they're known, we can certainly do that. I think he has to begin, as Jan pointed out, with unfinished business. There's a lot of unfinished business. Now, one of the odd things about this reform was that normally it's the incoming Secretary General who brings the reform, not the outgoing one who tries to leave it as a legacy. One, it weakened the Secretary General's ability to move this forward because not only was he a lame duck Secretary General, but he was a wounded, and many people thought tarnished Secretary General by the end, and was not in the best position to move this forward. It's not widely known, but Boutros-Ghali, when he got in trouble, had the notion of putting forward a really big reform that maybe this would help salvage his tenure. Fortunately, in the last minute, he was wise enough not to put it forward, although it was a pretty good package. But it does seem to me this is an unusual situation. So now the incoming Secretary General, with whatever credibility, whatever honeymoon period he might be able to muster, is told your first job is to clean up the business from the last one. Well, fortunately, there's still a lot of good ideas on the table that were left over from this last reform that do deserve attention. I think it's a little unfair to a new Secretary General, but I think and I think he is modest enough to recognize that this is the first thing that has to be done. The Human Rights Council, I don't know whether the Secretary General can do much about it, but I think one has to push. I would look, frankly, for the U.S. to try to work more effectively with our European allies on this. I don't think our friends and other countries concerned with human rights, from a positive viewpoint, have carried their weight at all in the Human Rights Council so far, and I don't think business as usual in a slightly smaller forum is acceptable. The Peace-Building Commission, I think, has taken, hopefully, a positive turn now that they're actually dealing with Burundi. And I heard a report from one of the ambassadors on Friday, which sounded encouraging on this. But, of course, most of the months have been spent deciding who sits around the table, because reform around the UN has, by and large, been about turf. And hopefully now they're getting to substance, and I think there is some possibility there. In terms of management, I would assume that the new Secretary General will come up with something that's a bit of a mix of the existing proposals, and some new ones. I think, people are looking for new ideas, and yet there's some things on the table that still make a good deal of sense. This mother of all high-level panels, the last one launched on system-wide coherence. Here's one that finally has 3 sitting heads of state or government on it, launched at the last minute, told to solve the problem that no one has been able to do in 61 years, bring coherence to a system that was designed not to be coherent, because it was designed on functionalist terms so that the politics would not infect the agencies and they would each go their own way with their own boards and funding, et cetera, et cetera. So yeoman job. It looks to me like they're coming up with a sensible report which focuses more on coherence, at least nationally, in the field, even if you can't achieve real coherence at headquarters. So I think that makes some sense. We were told we were supposed to say a word about the mandate review. There's a slight bit of light at the end of that tunnel. Ireland and Pakistan are now leading this effort. But it was never, frankly, a very promising initiative. When you have 9,000-10,000 mandates, people can't even count them. It's hard enough to define them. Where do you start? And, of course, people are always worried when you get to that final cluster about the Palestinian entities in the UN And because people are worried where you're going to end up, they have a really hard time starting. It's not unusual in international organizations. But I think there will be some quiet consolidation and rationalization there, but I wouldn't urge a new Secretary General to spend a lot of time on it. Second, on this transition period, which is really a great blessing, a luxury. The largest transition period we ever had before was when Boutros Ghali came in, when he had 4 weeks. And this was considered a pretty long period. Now we've got 2.5 months. It's extraordinary. And I think it's some ways encouraging for the organization. When people thought this is going to be a very divisive choice, they'd be lucky to get it before November and probably late November. All of a sudden, they came together. They found a candidate rather early. I think with the backing of 4 of the partners in the 6-party talks, the U.S., Russia, China, and Japan being on the council at the moment, I think they formed rather early a sense that this was a sensible choice. Maybe not an exciting choice, but a sensible choice. And they had an early choice in which it's not evident that he owes his loyalty or his nomination to any particular capital. I mean, John Bolton has been quick to sort of claim that this is a U.S. candidate, but I don't think the Koreans ever saw him as a U.S. candidate. I don't think the others particularly saw him as a U.S. candidate. And one of Kofi Annan's problems, of course, early on was he was the U.S. candidate. Very clearly was the U.S. candidate, and just as Boutros Ghali had been the French candidate. But now that we have this time, I think he'll do what he does best. Listen, 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 listen. My impression is he's not someone who wants to put out huge visions that are his personal visions. He wants to find out what the member states want. And he realizes that he hasn't been spending the last 40 years around the UN, and he has a lot to learn. So, he may have a certain personal modesty, but it seems to me he has a certain modesty about the task ahead of him. I think that's very refreshing. And I think it's not such a bad thing that he's not going to be an overnight media star. He stumbles through his speeches in English. Be quite frank about it. It's not his forte. It's also not the forte of the current President of the General Assembly, so it's going to be an interesting time for those looking for media sound bites. But I think it's not such a bad thing. There is a role for Secretary General as being the world, moral leader, et cetera, but most of them get to that over time. If they begin with that, I think they can be in some trouble. So I think starting small is not so bad. And every Secretary General has been chosen not because he's a particularly good orator. None of them were thought to be. Some of them turned out to be. Some of them didn't, of course. But they were picked precisely because they were not going to be alternative global speakers. The G5 and others still want to maintain that. So I think starting small is not such a bad thing. He's obviously going to be working very hard on building bridges, and he keeps talking about that. And if you talk to the member states, what do they like about him? He listens and he builds bridges. He's a consensus builder. He's not, a visionary. And that's what they're looking for, and, that gives them cautious optimism. Second of all, he's obviously going to be building a team. Not an easy thing to do. You may have seen John Bolton dismissed all of the Secretary General's advisors from the rostrum of the General Assembly the other day, which was interesting, but I think Ban Ki-moon will actually look at the current people as well as new people. And see what makes sense. I think he's going to focus on a few pieces of the management reform. He has said many times that job one, come January 1, is to do the management reform and move as far as he can on that. Not because it's Washington's agenda, but because it should be the organization's agenda. It should be every bit as much or more the G77's agenda. They should care as much as anyone about how it's managed. He'll have to work on redefining the relationship and the boundaries between the General Assembly and the Secretary General and the Secretariat on management and budgetary issues. He's got to clarify some of the gray areas. He's got to really focus on the Deputy Secretary General post. David will remember, because we were involved in this back with the Strengthening Working Group in the mid-'90s when this was created. It was a post that was created without any real job definition. And that's the way the Secretary General wanted it. But now it's a job that really needs definition. We saw this with the oil for food crisis. There needs to be some kind of line relationship with others through the deputy, and whether that's a chief operating officer or something different, but something that has some line authority, we'll have to see how that works. But I think, perhaps the good news at this point is that there are, in many ways, such low expectations of the Secretary General. No, really, he's coming in, and people say, yeah, he's got a good resume, and people like him, whatever. But, my God, he's not the media star. That's great. That's great. People don't expect a lot of him. And to me, that's very often where leadership begins. He said something which, actually, the only other speaker on that Friday, the 13th of all days, although we're told in Korea 4 is the unlucky number, not 13, when he was voted in by the Assembly, of all the regional leaders who came and spoke, and the Secretary General who spoke, everyone else, except for John Bolton, he got it right, said that this was the election of the new Secretary General. Ban got up, and he said that he'd been appointed. It's a big difference. It was decided in San Francisco, after some debate, that they were not electing a world leader. They're appointing an administrative head of an organization. And I think if someone begins with that, and begins with that focus on administration and management, I think in the end of the day, we may end up with more of a global leader than we expected, and I hope we will. But I think maybe we'll get some real progress in the meantime, and I'll pray about that. But anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you, Ed. Let me begin our discussion, Jan, by inviting you to comment, if you choose to do so, on what Ed has said.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for this treat, Ed. It's also have your perspective on the last session and our negotiations and our reforms. Fortunately, I can agree with you on practically all points now. If I had been Foreign Minister of Sweden or President of the General Assembly, I would have probably had to reduce that number and not agree with everything. But I think on the issue where you thought we would part company, I think I can clarify what I meant. When I talked about the need for a holistic and a comprehensive approach, I was thinking more in terms of after we have done the reform, after we have negotiated, then we should see the interrelationship between the different activities. So I was aiming more at the implementation and how we really deal with the issues out there in the field when we are ready, like in the Peace Building Commission, rather than in the negotiations. I spent a lot of time, as you know, in negotiations telling them to avoid linkages. So therefore, negotiation is one phase where you are right, but implementation and realities force us to think and act more horizontally and less vertically. Oh, well, we could do both, in fact. Management, it's absolutely crucial that management becomes a concern for all. The mandate review also was blown out of proportion as an issue. To go through this with 9,000 to 10,000 mandates, can you imagine? Do you know of any national parliament, for instance, in the world, which has gone through the mandates of all the decisions in a parliament? I don't know of any organization which has gone through the historic process of legislation. We are asking for a gargantuan, Herculean task. And I appreciate my Pakistani and Irish colleagues. I really commend them for this very, very hard work, and Bob Orr and others in the Secretariat. But I feel that it was almost an unnecessary burden to take on, at least the size of it. Especially since we know that the aim was to get rid of certain resolutions. And from the American side, it was the resolutions related to Israel-Palestine. And to get rid of resolutions, you wouldn't know how many lobbies there are for every mandate. The strangest issue has 5 or 6 countries that are fighting hard to keep it. And once these lobbies get going, they immobilize the organization. So that I really regretted that I got in my lap so strongly, and with such political dimensions. I have to be more hopeful on the Human Rights Council, Ed. It's a good resolution, it's a good text. We have to live up to the text. We have to remind the countries of the text. We have to, I think, use in a positive way public opinion. We should put them under pressure. It's extremely important that this gets off to a better start. But this summer there was really also this, all the images from the Middle East influenced all those decisions. The European Union, of course, voted against some of the issues that I know left strong reactions in the United States. But one couldn't disregard the feelings that were created from the, not least the bombings of Lebanon and what happened in Gaza this summer. So the vote on that commission, even if I think the president, the Mexican ambassador, was trying, led to results that hurt the position of Human Rights Council in the United States. I still hope that the US will come to the conclusion that it's better to be inside than outside. That decision has to be taken sometime, I guess, by the end of this year or beginning of next year. And the United Nations belongs on that council. The voice of the US is needed. I always, in my comments to the press, reminded of Eleanor Roosevelt and the traditions that the United States stands for, I would hope. Negotiations. I was under instruction from this summit meeting to conduct negotiations in an open, transparent, and inclusive manner. That means that I had to make sure that whatever we did was embraced by 192 nations. But you can imagine negotiating resolutions on human rights and on peacebuilding commission with 192 nations aiming to come up with a consensus outcome. Talk about Herculean tasks. So what we have to do is to probably institute more informal types of meetings and discussions. In the process, I must say it was a natural thing for me to consult individually or together sometimes. But when I did it together, I got some problems with those outside that I wasn't working in a transparent fashion. But I was meeting them individually and often also collectively in groups like the G77, headed by South Africa, the European Union, which do not only have the 27 members on board, but also 25, it's going to be 27, but also another 10 or 15 who are aspiring to become members of the European Union. So the European Union represents a bloc of 40 nations. So the European Union presidency was extremely important. I had great help of Emerson Jones Parry when the British were in the presidency, and particularly to the Human Rights Council negotiations with the Austrians who were in the chair. So I could work through them and by that reach 35 to 40 countries. And then, of course, the P5 is always an entity that you have to talk to individually, or more than together perhaps. And then CANS, the Canada, New Zealand, Australia. And then I was discreetly encouraging the member states to meet at breakfast, at lunches, at coffees. Because in the end, so much in diplomacy, in fact in life, is about human relations. If you trust someone and want to make a deal with someone, I said you have to get together with this and that. So, and then on the new Secretary General, I don't know whether you're implying criticism of Kofi Annan and me there, that we are too visible. And, I take it. But still, I don't know whether you're right. Because we also have to remember that the United Nations is an organization that has to face two realities. One, the realities of the real problems, the poverty, the diseases, the wars. But also this organization has to be seen, or the reality that we have to bring into the halls of the United Nations is the realities of the expectations, the aspirations, and I would say even the dreams of international cooperation and international solidarity. And for that you have to mobilize public opinion. And you have to be clear, you have to be seen, the Secretary is the symbol of these expectations, these aspirations, these dreams. I think it's good not to start with sort of Don Quixotic type of appearances, but it's also good to mobilize, and sometimes even shame. And I think Ban Ki-moon, I know him since 1999, I think he will go through the same development that I would hope characterized Dag Hammarskjöld or also Kofi Annan. Dag Hammarskjöld was considered a very neutral, in all respects, civil servant of Sweden. Had no profile, rather greyish-looking, formal. And look what Dag Hammarskjöld became. And Kofi Annan was considered by some United Nations bureaucrat. He had spent all his life in UNHCR and so forth. And he also lifted some occasions. He had difficulties around Iraq, of course the oil for food, but also the Iraq war, understandably. But he also grew with the office. There is something magic about this charter and about this office, that you grow with it. You are the person on which these expectations are directed. And I would say it's very important that this Secretary General, any Secretary General, is not only the Chief Administrative Officer, but that he is also the one that can exercise leadership and point the direction. Article 99 of the UN Charter, read it and reread it. He can take up any issue. We need a strong Secretary General, someone who's also in the end visible, perhaps not visible with rhetoric, but visible with action, and taking positions, standing up for the principles of the Charter. So here may be a little bit of a difference with you on that one. Okay, that's my comments.
Thank you, Jan. Let me just ask one further question, and then I'll invite your questions. Everyone has agreed, and I agree, Shirley, that management reform is important, that not enough has been accomplished, that there is a very considerable and sensible agenda still out there. There is time between now and the end of the year for consideration of a number of management reform issues, and I know the General Assembly is charged with completing work on one or more within that rather short period of time, and the rest will remain for the new Secretary General. Let me ask you two questions related to that. First, what, in your view, are the most important of the management reforms, the ones to which the Secretary General and the membership should give highest priority? And second, how do you go about building the coalition, which obviously does not exist, has not been accomplished, that is necessary for action on those reforms in the General Assembly?
Why don't you start?
Okay, thank you. I guess thank you. Looking for a softball question, not a hard one. One of the problems with management reform, I mean, I hate to say it, but in some ways, it's a bit of a package. Yeah. You know, as much as I don't like packages.
Thank you very much.
As much as I don't like packages.
But not with Security Council reform.
No, but I mean, those are generically very different items.
I appreciate
Security Council
that.
reform.
I'm kidding.
There are pieces you can pick out on management that make sense. Some of them have been accomplished. I frankly thought that when the Volcker report came out, at that point in time, there was sufficient momentum politically to move forward on a lot more management changes than happened, and that they could have been pursued on their own at that point, and a great deal achieved. And I think the member states would have had a lot of sympathy for the Secretary General's position, and would have, in fact, gone a good deal farther than they did in the end. Obviously, the whistleblower protection that's been achieved is helpful. That obviously has to be carried out in practice. The sense of an ethics office may be helpful. I would focus very heavily on human resource questions. Some of the toughest. I remember when Kofi Annan was the head of personnel way back when, and we had done a big study at UNA on management in the mid-'80s. And he thought it was all terrific, and going to do all these things, and well, it never happened for whatever reason. But it does seem to me this is one of these hardy perennials that really has to be addressed. And as Ban said in his acceptance speech, we don't want to reform human resources as a penalty to the Secretariat, but to liberate the Secretariat. So that the best people feel that they do have possibilities of advancement It's not all politics, and that merit is recognized, that good people are recruited and given useful things to do, and that you actually do something about deadwood rather than keep it around. You probably remember when we were engaged in these things in the mid-'90s, people said, gee, we have to keep certain departments and whatever because you have to have a place to put the deadwood. We have all this deadwood, and you don't want them doing important things, so you have a place to put them. And that's not the most advanced way of approaching management, I don't think. So, I think personnel is extremely important, and the justice system within the organization, which I've never fully understood, but no one seems to be very happy with it. When there are problems with the Secretariat or when they have grievances, I think those things have to be addressed up front. I do think the question of giving the Secretary General a bit more leeway on moving people and resources horizontally is extremely important. There is, this terrible divide that, people are afraid they're going to take it from development purposes and put them for security purposes, whatever. But I think that in some ways, some of the member states I've talked to quite a few about this, they feel that what he asked for really didn't make sense, that he asked for too much in a way, and the numbers were sort of off, that the Assembly would have agreed to something but not sort of the package the way he asked it. I get the sense from a number of the member states, including from the G77, that they would be quite willing to revisit the question of what are the boundaries on these sorts of questions between the Assembly's prerogatives and those of the Secretariat. They didn't want to do it with a spending cap in front of them. They didn't want to do it because of demands from Washington, but they recognized that generically for the organization there were some things that could usefully be done there. So I think those are all areas in which one could work on, and there are others, but those I think the ones I would put the highest priority, in addition to the question of the Deputy Secretary General and how you work those things out. I mean, I would be really radical, and I would say, and I argued when the U.S. first took this post that we shouldn't do it, when the NSC was inquiring about it. I think it was in Bush the father's administration, that the U.S. should not have the top U.S. post should not be the management and budgetary post. We should have a political post many other people can manage, and we shouldn't be typecast that way. I would argue that if they can find a top flight manager from the developing world, that would be terrific. To have an American go down and plead in the Fifth Committee gets you less than nowhere. And I think having someone from developing country would be a terrific idea. From Washington, that'd be radical reform. They'd be very upset. But I think it might be a good thing for the organization.
Well, as an American who has had that opportunity, or I should say burden of pleading in the Fifth Committee, I couldn't agree with you more. Jan?
I also agree with practically everything Ed has said. I think we should also pick up one of Ed's earlier lessons learned, and that is now is the time for this transition team, which has 2.5 months to go still, or a little bit less, to consult with the member states and make sure that management is seen, is embraced by all member states. I think he should see some of the key actors and consult with them so that you make sure that management is a responsibility for all. And then I think he should exercise, that's where I think he should build on the chief administrative officer, because there is an inbuilt contradiction in this, that he is the chief administrative officer. Sounds very good, but then he is limited so much by the Fifth Committee, the General Assembly, that micromanages so much of the activities. I think he should gain ground. Sometimes you ask yourself, why do you ask? Why not do it? I mean, there are so many such situations where you can do the reasonable thing. Of course, with, do consultations and feeling this is the right thing. And I think there is room for doing more on that authority of being chief administrative officer. And that in combination with consultations to spread the sense of ownership, I think is great. And I think your idea is good, that U.S. Perhaps should not always claim that post in management, which increases that impression that management is an American issue. It's wrong. It must be an international issue. It relates to all of us. Well, I was talking about developing a culture of efficiency. And what I know from my own experience is that we don't mobilize enough the complete potential inside the United Nations, and also, as I said earlier, the potential of all other actors that are needed to deal with the problems. So I think ways of coordinating better with with the specialized agencies and regional actors is something that I think could be very, very important. If you take care of the results of, it sounded promising, the high-level panel recommendations, if they are good enough, one can build on that to then institute those mechanisms so that we work better inside the system of the UN, but also with others. There are so many inbuilt problems inside even the UN family. You know, if you talk about FAO and WHO and UNESCO, I remember when I went to with Boutros-Ghali to Rome to an ACC meeting, all the heads of agencies and the leadership of the UN. The head of FAO at the time, he greeted his colleagues first, then he added at the end, Mr. Secretary General. And Boutros-Ghali whispered to me, it's like the 13th century, the Pope and the Cardinals. The Cardinals were more important than the Pope. And they are sitting on their own mandates. And the bosses of these heads of these organizations are not in New York. They are the ministers of agriculture in the member states, FAO, and social affairs from WHO. And that goes back to the lack of coordination in our own countries. Because if the Minister of Foreign Affairs tells the Minister of Agriculture that you have to get rid of these protectionist measures, well, the Minister of Agriculture has the agriculture lobbies at home. So here is something very, very basically problematic. I don't think we will solve it. It's a huge problem. But I think measures have to be taken, and I think we should use this high-level panel and reach out to that better coordination inside the system and with those outside. Then I think you should probably have a team of troubleshooters, because if we want to be serious about prevention, then I think the Secretary General and the Security Council should act much earlier. Send out fact-finding missions, send out envoys, I was about to say missionaries, emissaries, emissaries, and have a team of troubleshooters, a la Brahimi, who would get out there under his leadership and, of course, let him in the end have the credit. So those are my main points.
Thank you, Jan. Ed, do you want to say something?
I'd like to pose a question, particularly to Ambassador Eliasson. You referred to public opinion, and yet the focus has been on member states and their decision authority, which is clearly the main event. This leads me then to raise the question about what you see as the current and future roles of NGOs in this work. Is it solely to mobilize public opinion, or do you see some broader and more important roles for NGOs, both in the UN reform as well as in the wider processes of the organization?
Well, thank you, Ed, for taking up this very important point. Of course, let's face it, United Nations is constituted on the participation of governments representing countries, and some governments are more representative than others, and some are democratic, some are not. But we also should recall that the first three words of the UN Charter is "we the peoples." And I think we have to reach out and make sure that we reach out to the civil society and the NGOs. I set up, I had 2 ambassadors working on this. There's a report out, but in this case, I hope it's not only words. We had very, very strong NGO participation in the AIDS conference in end of May, beginning of June. 800 NGOs were there. And in the negotiations, which was a difficult thing for me, because they wanted very much to be part of the negotiations of the Human Rights Council and the Peace Building Commission. There, of course, you can understand that with several countries that was a problem. If you can sit in that room and talk about, the possibility of having a suspension of membership from the Human Rights Council, and then to have the NGO community in the room was a difficult one. So I couldn't have in the crucial negotiations the NGOs in on the negotiations, but I had a very deep, very strong consultation process with all. And they were in on practically all these negotiations. And if you look at the text of the resolutions, there's a role given to the NGOs, both in the Human Rights Council and the Peace Building Commission. The 2 most important reforms, I would say, 2 institutional reforms. So we have to build hard on that, and not only, as I said, being as you indicate or hint, not only be advocates, but also be part of the processes. And I can tell you that when I was Under Secretary General, and for instance was in Somalia and Sudan, I had great help of these NGOs out in the field. That's where we could reach out. We couldn't get out with UN staff to all the villages in Somalia and Sudan, but it was the NGOs who were there. And even more, even better, they gave me more early warning signals than we got from the UN offices, because the UN offices were often, filled with people from their own regime. And therefore we had to handle information carefully. So I see a very great role on all levels for the NGOs and the civil society.
Let me now invite your questions. Do we have a microphone? Oh, good. If you'll just state your name and affiliation. Have any questions? Ed?
Edison Dick, United Nations Association. I just want to ask Ed something and follow up on the Human Rights Council, especially since this afternoon, about 5 hours, the UNA will be sponsoring a panel discussion on the Human Rights Council and the U.S. role in the, focusing on the U.S. role in the...
So we assume we have it settled by nightfall.
That's, that's right. But I would like to get your comment on whether you think the U.S. will and should and will seek to become a member of the council and the more broadly the U.S. role on that council.
Yeah, as a good Democrat, I'm not the best at predicting which way this administration will go. My guess is that they will stay out for the moment. I think it was a mistake initially. I think they should have worked harder and much better and smarter to create a council that they were more comfortable with. Although I think Jan did a yeoman's job putting it together, and I don't think it's basically an institutional problem. It's a political one. But then I think the U.S. should have stood for election to the council. I assume one of the reasons we didn't was that the general popularity of this country and this administration these days is such that I think they weren't sure they're going to get in.
I think it should be. Excuse me. I think it should be noted that the reasons given by the administration for not running had to do with dissatisfaction because the reforms were not sufficient. What were they? Well, it was the lack of a two-thirds voting requirement, and a lack of disqualification for countries which were under Security Council sanction. As it turns out, of course, if those two reforms had in fact been included, the outcome would have been exactly as took place. So it would have made no difference whatsoever.
Yeah, I think the U.S. really shot itself in the foot when John Bolton made this comment to the Washington Post that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council should have automatic seats in the new Human Rights Council, because at the time we were arguing, one is, as David says, that there should be criteria for membership, and then we go against that. 2, we were arguing it should be quite small, and how we can argue that habitual human rights abusers like China and Russia should automatically be members of this pristine club was a little hard to imagine. It's just given the situation now, both domestically and in the operations of the Council, I think it would be hard for the U.S. to say at this point we're going to jump aboard.
I think we'll negotiate with North Korea before we run.
But I also want to add that my decision to go for the vote was facilitated by my contacts with the U.S. administration in the last few days. I then got the indication both from Secretary Rice and Nick Burns, the number 3, I'm Under Secretary of Political Affairs, that U.S. was going to cooperate with the Council, and that U.S. was continue to fund the Human Rights Office, and that U.S. was considering membership or running for membership next year. When I heard that, that's where I felt confident that I would go for it, because I'll tell you very, very sincerely that this was one of my most difficult decisions, to go to that vote, because if this had led to a complete confrontation and reaction in Congress and in public opinion, I was risking so much. So here I must say that Condi Rice and Nick Burns and the instructions they gave to New York were very welcome, especially since this came out in the press on the morning of the vote. These positions that I just, these considerations that I just mentioned: cooperate with the council, continue the funding, and consider membership. So that was said publicly, not publicly, I think in an informal briefing the day before, appeared in the press, and I saw lots of ambassadors go to that assembly hall relieved that they were not faced with a complete confrontation with the US. So I would hope that one would take that step, but I understand the concerns and the aspects that Ed brought out. You've got to get the vote also.
Ed, Andy, rather.
Andy Rice, United Nations Association. I wonder if either of our two speakers could say anything about the role they anticipate the new President of the General Assembly playing. I have no sense whatsoever about what kind of a role she sees herself as carrying out, and it would be very illuminating if they could give us any clues.
Well, I'd just say she has the same problem I do. She's a very hard act to follow. And in a larger sense, when I was talking about Secretary General and being spokesperson, etc., part of that is that I think the President of the General Assembly should have a larger role as a spokesperson for the organization. And if you get the right president, that works very well. But as I say, over the years, the record has been more mixed. I don't think I'm in a good position to comment on the current president. I think she's working hard at it. I think her efforts are appreciated. She obviously does not have all the skills that her predecessor had. And among those is that she's not an effective spokesperson in English. She probably is in Arabic, but not in English. And she may not see her role. She may not have quite the confidence, not having been around the organization as long. But, again, she will and has been learning on the job. The problem is, President General Assembly has 12 months. That's not very long to learn on the job. And one of the things I think we've lost is that very often the presidents of the General Assembly have been critical to past reform efforts. And yet there's no real record. And there's no institutional memory. They go off, and who knows what worked and what didn't work for them, and their perspectives on this. So, I think that this post has varied so much that, as I said earlier, I would put a lot more attention on who's chosen and why. And there has been some effort to bolster the office. As David will remember, back in the mid-'90s, they had no support, basically. Now they have a little bit of support. And some countries can pull in more when their national has this job. But it's a very, very demanding job, especially if you're trying to do a lot of things on the reform front. And I think more appreciation needs to be made of it.
Looking back at the workload, I don't think I would go for a 2-year term. But from a rational perspective, probably you need to do so. I had 15 people working for me, and covering all 6 committees and the negotiation tracks, that was a huge work. They worked 14, 15 hours a day, and I did the same.
How many did you have to bring in?
Well, Sweden paid for 4, I think, 3 or 4. And only 2 are paid for by the UN. And then you have some, fixed posts. But I think you're right that office should be strengthened, and it's a regional circulation on it. And but I think one really has to see that this is the person who symbolizes the General Assembly, and there are tensions and even growing tensions between the Security Council and General Assembly. I felt that particularly during the consultations about the next Secretary General, that there were expectations that the General Assembly should play a more active role. But on so many other issues, Peacebuilding Commission and others, I felt those tensions. And the President of the General Assembly then is the symbol of the most democratic, or the most democratic organization. The organization represents one member, one vote. Sheikh Haya is a good person. I like her very much. She's very knowledgeable. She has not as much experience in the UN as I had, but she was ambassador in France. She has a strong legal background. And I don't know whether I should say this, but I mean, look what the message that you have an Arab woman being President of the General Assembly is, I think, a very powerful message. But of course, you have very hard work to do also on the substantial side. I advised her, and she and I have excellent relations, to work very much with co-chairs. I had, 8 or 9 co-chair teams that were working under me and who reported to me. And I got involved actually almost systematically only the last phase. The heavy lifting during the first phase of negotiation was done by a co-chair team, and then the presidency comes in. And I think that's a good way of alleviating the burden somewhat. I'm also glad that she took over 3 of my staff in my president's office who were working with her. One of them is Parfait Onanga, who was already with my predecessor. And 2 of my best staff are also with her now. So I think we should give her all the help. She's only at the beginning of her time, and make sure that she and the next Secretary General succeed.
Yeah, could I just add one comment? I think we should recognize that your predecessor, Jean Ping, did quite a good job from Gabon. You don't have to be from a large or wealthy country to do a good job with this. And
you mean like Sweden?
Large, wealthy. I said large or wealthy. You're not going to claim modesty on that too, are you?
No.
But I mean, obviously Gabon does not have enormous resources, but he did, I think, quite an effective job putting the pieces together. And he had, I think it was 15 or so teams.
Same stuff.
Yeah, very, very, very large teams, and some of the staff. But I think he sort of set the stage in a way, and then you carried it very, very much farther than anyone expected it could have gone.
Other questions?
Let me just offer one reflection on that. I wonder whether this experience could gradually be institutionalized into some stronger office of the President of the General Assembly, where you would have a greater politically driven leadership for reform and other decisions.
Yeah, it could be the way to go. There's growing interest of the member states to strengthen that position.
Yes.
Samira Daniels. I'm interested in interfaith issues. I wanted to go back to the issue of prevention. And in the discussions about Darfur, I think that the most amazing thing in all of this is that, the Darfur issue sort of like exploded in 2000, 2001. And, it brings you back to like, well, what was happening before? So my question is, in terms of prevention, what are the 1 or 2 key things you think we could do to sort of educate the people that are involved in conflict resolution in the United Nations? I mean, what can you do to sort of get people to understand that you shouldn't wait till things just like, as you said, in the worst situation possible. So.
Well, my only contribution to academic community is what I call the ladder of prevention, or sort of now I would extend it to a pyramid of prevention. The steps that you could take before use of force is being used and is being applied. First is, of course, to have an early warning system which functions so that you know what the problems are, including media attention, and even the worst dictators are sensitive to media. Secondly, you have fact-finding missions to just come there, become international eyes and ears in a conflict. Third level rung is the Article 33 of the UN Charter. Pacific Settlement Disputes is the rubric for the Chapter 6, and Article 33 lists 8 measures that need to be applied for peaceful settlements: mediation, arbitration, negotiation, etc. Fourth level is preventive deployment, to have presence. We had it in Yugoslavia back in the early 90s, late 80s, to have forces or observers in place to stop a conflict from erupting. And then you move into Chapter 7, sanctions, but then sanctions that should be targeted, not, in my view, generally activating, but targeted, so that you close the bank accounts and stop the wives of the dictators to shop in Paris and so forth. And sports sanctions are very good. If you don't, if the South Africans couldn't play rugby with the Australians, that was something. Oh la la. And then there is a very civilized use of force, and that's the credible threat of the use of force. So that the P5 show that if you don't do this, we will. And that would imply a less frequent use of the veto. I think we cannot abolish the veto, but we should introduce a veto-free culture. The veto should be used. The Security Council should work like the Catholic Church when they select popes. They should get into that room, and then they should get out when the smoke gets out. Now the resolution is ready. Use of veto should be seen as a failure, or even bad taste. That was a side remark. And then you have use of force. But then also, the reason I'm changing this from a ladder to a pyramid is that you go down after use of force, unfortunately, often implied. And it has to be applied also by the UN. I'm not a pacifist. I think UN's use of force is very important, that you have Chapter 7. Otherwise, you are not credible on the other steps. But once that situation comes up, it's important that you do what the Peace Building Commission aims to do afterwards, so that the conflicts don't erupt again, so that we don't get into the evil circle that we're doing now in Afghanistan and Somalia. Then you have to go back and do the reconstruction, development, institution building, reconciliation processes, so that it doesn't erupt again. By that you have a pyramid. I have a paper on that.
Last question. Yes, you.
Thank you. Pam Pelletro, I'm an independent person. I was struck with the need
Congratulations.
Thank you. I enjoy it. I was struck with President Eliasson's reference to the need to build bridges. And I was wondering if you had given thought as to how the NGO community could support the United Nations in the achievement of this goal.
Well, just keep working at it. Come here, come to these meetings, spread the word. Write your congressman. I'm not interfering in the party.
Oh, no.
Am I?
You can now.
Can I?
No, you step down.
Oh, it's great. I went to school in Indiana. Does that help?
That helps.
High school
Great
Indiana,
deal.
American Field Service. No, I think it's very important that Americans show that you realize that Shakespeare is right in Romeo and Juliet, that there is a world outside Verona. And for the larger countries, it's harder to come to that conclusion, because you think, that is historic fact, that you can do things on your own, and you can manage problems on your own, because you have the power, you have the size, you have the resources. But in today's world, it doesn't matter whether you're big or small. When it comes to environmental threats, diseases, terrorism, we're all in the same boat. And I would hope this tragedy of Iraq will lead to that conclusion, that it's better to do things together. And that U.S. would be a champion for multilateralism. Because I think it's, since the domestic and international problems now intertwined, it's in the enlightened self-interest, national interest, to work multilaterally. But that is why it's so important what we're talking about here. We have then to make sure that we have mechanisms that work for multilateral cooperation. That's what was driving me during this presidency, that it was so much at stake. If you are a champion of multilateralism, you have to prove that you have mechanisms to work and methods of working with it. So it's a sort of a circular reasoning, but we need the U.S. I mean, the UN needs the United States, but I also claim the United States needs the UN.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
That's our theme. UN making a difference together.
Yeah, hi, good to see you. How are you?
I emailed her to you this morning
How are things?
because I had no address.